Hi, I'm Kristen Brandt, and today we're going to be talking about urban sustainability. And this is video one. Video one is going to focus on the positives of sustainable design initiatives. We're going to talk about some mixed land use, walkability, transportation, all these different policies. But before I do that, I'm going to do a little teaser. If you happen to watch daily video 6.6, I highlighted a building called 340 on the Park that overlooked Millennium Park. I'm not going to put the picture in this one. I'd love it if you go back and check it out. But that building is built in Chicago and actually received a lot of green awards um, for its architecture, the use of materials, and also how they disposed of the materials that they unearthed, and also what they didn't use in the building process. That's all part of this urban sustainability. And so let's dig a little bit closer into what we're going to look at. Remember, this is first of all, what is it? And then we're going to focus on the positives today. So, what we're looking at is that long term viability of cities. So, I touched on a little bit the environment. So, our land use. If we're putting up new buildings, what are we doing with the materials that we're using or we're already there? How do we make sure that the soil is not contaminated? What resources are we using? In other words, what pressures are we placing on systems that are already there, but also taking a look at alternative forms of energy? How do we maximize solar power, wind power? What about green roofs? And we also need to acknowledge population pressures. And so, as our urban areas grow, that we've talked about throughout this unit, how do we make sure that what we're doing has long term benefits instead of harming the people, the environment, the country? So, how do we do that? One way we've seen this, and we've seen this a lot in Europe, but we've seen other places as well, are creating green belts. This is the undeveloped land around an urban area. Let's protect it. Let's put some zoning areas in place. And so we'll look at some images that do that. We also talk about smart growth policies, and we've seen a lot of that in the United States. And these are policies that are put in place to preserve that farmland. We talked about it with urban sprawl earlier in this unit. We've talked about it with unrestricted growth, that if we don't protect it, we're going to start eating up some of that land. And we've also seen then the development of this new policy, these new solutions of the new urbanism movement. Let's actually focus on how do we reduce urban sprawl? How do we use what's already there? But we also need to increase affordable housing. Go back to that bid rent theory where all of a sudden it just gets too expensive to live in some of these areas. So some of that then is creating these mixed use neighborhoods. And when we talk about mixed use neighborhoods, we're talking about the integration of residential and commercial areas. We're talking about bringing in a variety of different types of homes at different price points and increasing the diversity of our communities. Let's see what it actually looks like then. So, for example, the green belt, this is in China, and you can see surrounding part of that city is how do we preserve some of that land to keep it fresh and create those green spaces, especially important in places where we know that are really heavily crowded, highly densely populated areas. To have these open spaces help to give space to room to breathe and develop. In Chicago, Daniel Burnham was who knew, pretty insightful of how to develop our area. And you see all the green on the left, and really focused on preserving our park system. So integrated into this urban area are these highly intricate parks so that people have places to kind of escape kind of that hustle and the bustle. But we also want to make sure that these areas, when we talk about sustainability, are creating these walkable areas. Great for the environment and also great for our health, right? And so we do things, if we look to the right, it's along the Chicago, the riverfront. That Riverwalk area is someplace areas that we're newly developing and offering new businesses along there, but it's also a draw for tourism. The image on the left in New York, the High Line system. We see this in a lot of cities where we take old rail lines and they transport them into walkways or bike places, those areas to escape, but then we start to see these cute little businesses that sometimes pop up along these areas to kind of service those people as well. We also want to talk about mass transportation, the movement of people in and out of these cities. And so we take a look at looking for environmentally friendly options and how do we make sure that we start moving towards these clean, green options. My husband takes the train every day. We live in the suburbs. And so taking the train into Chicago instead of having to sit in traffic, and then park the car also helps that with the environment. That sustainability, we talked about using solar energy. We can see how it's integrated here into communities. The image is that we're taking a look at. Some of these are in the Netherlands. This is something we're seeing in a lot of core areas, that how do we capitalize in building and then using that energy to really propel our cities moving forward. And ultimately, it's really this development of mixed use areas. And so our residential, our commercial, you can see how they're integrated here, and then a variety of homes. You might have some apartments, some single family, you might have different types of zoning policies so that we're having availability to a variety of different homes is going to then also welcome a variety of people into those communities. So how does that play out? Well, crazy. There was an FRQ question that wanted us to explain 2 benefits of mixed use development in promoting urban growth. So I'm going to have you pause, think about it, because ultimately that's what I want you to take away. I want you to take away, when we talk about these urban design initiatives, that the positives here, it's the access to services, recreation, jobs. It's increasing a sense of community by creating these mixed use developments, less time in travel, reducing traffic. And a lot of this is by that mass transportation, right? Decreasing energy, fuel use. We're going to see that it does tend to increase home values, and that's a positive for those that own the homes. We will talk in video 2 about how that can create some problems as well. But we do start to see this revitalization of urban landscapes, such as the High Line that I showed you earlier in the video. Preservation or conservation of parks, I showed you Chicago, where we're integrating that into those urban areas. And really, it's curbing urban sprawl through more efficient use of space. It's having that plan, it's working together so that we're not just building haphazardly. I hope you enjoyed video 1 of taking a look at urban sustainability and the positives, and I hope you join me for video 2 where we look at some of those criticisms. Have a great day. Hi, I'm Kristen Brandt, and today we're going to be talking about urban sustainability. And really, we're going to be focusing on the criticisms of urban design initiatives. If you join me for video 1, we focused on the positives. This video is really looking at some increased housing costs, maybe some possible segregation, and potential loss of historical character. So let's dig into this. I also think it's really important for us to review, just in case you haven't seen the first video. So what do I mean by urban design initiatives? So we reviewed the green belt. So this is that protection of the land around urban areas. We see this a lot in Europe, a lot in some Asian countries as well. And this is that idea of how do we make sure we keep some of that green space. We also see here, in particular in North America, we see smart growth, these policies that we put in place to preserve the farmland, especially because of unrestricted urban sprawl. We want to make sure that we hold on to that farmland so that we are able to produce enough to support our country as well. And that is really where new urbanism, that movement comes out of this, is so let's put practices in place, let's work with developers, let's work with planners for ways that we can reduce that urban sprawl, increase affordable housing, and then also by really using that idea of mixed use neighborhoods. I focused a lot on really how this would help increase diversity, how it's in theory supposed to help bring down some of those housing costs. But what you'll see is that there's the theory, and then sometimes in practice, it doesn't always play out. And so that's where some of the concerns are starting to be developed, is that are these areas really as affordable as we want them to be? And I think some of that comes from a couple things. One, when we start really redeveloping areas, it costs money. It takes money to do those things. So that's going to increase the cost. But also, as these neighborhoods become more desirable, that increase the cost. And so does that then push people out? And that's where we start to see some of that loss of diversity in these areas. We also know as we continue to build these areas that have huge draws with people, that's going to put pressure on the infrastructure, on our transportation, on our services, our schools, our hospitals. And so that's a concern, as well as some of the loss of distinctive characteristics. I mean, think about it. When we start kind of mass producing some of these things, we lose some of the charm and that character. And so we're going to look at some examples here a little bit more closely. So, price of homes. These are some of the cities with the most expensive average home price across the world. And so what we know is that many of them are really focused on those areas closer to the central business district. And so we talk about if you really dig into these cities, you're going to see that they're trying to maximize their land space. And so they're building up. But then how do we bring these urban initiatives into those areas? And so we do that by using a variety of different things. And so that spatial distribution definitely does play a role. And so if we can help kind of move people around, we can do that. But if you remember from video 1 in New York, we talked about transforming some certain areas. How do we make sure that there are parkways? How do we make sure that there are taking those old rail lines and turning those into walkable areas? That also makes these areas more desirable, which then increases those prices. We also know that if we take a look on the bottom right, this is in LA, because it is in such high demand. Even these areas where they've put these smart growth policies in place, where they've following the new urbanism ideas and initiatives, they become really, in those mixed use neighborhoods, they become very desirable. And that too is increasing the cost to even live in those areas. When those costs increase, we start to see de facto segregation taking place, because the affordability is not necessarily there, or access to those goods and services, in particular those resources such as school systems. It then pushes groups of people into areas where there maybe are not as many of those services. And so this list that you see is a ranking of some of the most segregated cities in the United States. And I would argue, again, those of you that know I live outside of Chicago, that you can definitely see some of these distinct neighborhoods. And we see a more heavily populated neighborhood of African Americans south of Chicago. We see a more white neighborhood north of Chicago. And a lot of that has to do with that access to services and land price as well. The more we continue to have some of these great resources on the outskirts and move people out, the pressures that puts on our infrastructure, in particular our transportation system. So we talked about mass transportation in video 1, but it takes a while to build that and to get it to those areas. And so in the meantime, people are driving. And so I will tell you, I have friends that work in Chicago that are not near train lines, and it can take them sometimes 2 hours to get into Chicago. Talk to some of your friends or meet some people that live in LA, and they'll talk about commute times. And as we continue to grow, the pressures that puts on that infrastructure. And I would say this is probably the one that makes me probably the most sad, is some of that loss of historical charm. You know, sometimes we're building at such unprecedented rates that it is easier to kind of mass produce our homes, those structures, to kind of mimic other plans. And in the process, we lose some of those distinctive characteristics that make cities and towns and communities unique. And so if you joined us for video 1, we focused on C here, explaining 2 benefits of that mixed use development and promoting urban growth. Today, we were really focusing on some of those criticisms of new urbanism. So I'm going to pause, because those are really the takeaways that I want you to have, or feel free to pause the video and think what I might show you next. So what I'm going to show you is that we do actually see high housing costs. We do actually see decreased diversity, even though that was not the intent. We see a strain on infrastructure with commutes, with keeping up and building schools at the same rate. We see that cost of building the mixed use areas is a strain on those communities. We also start to see this idea of placelessness, that loss of charm where everything starts to look the same. And really, some of the criticisms are that preference for yard space, detached home, and parking spaces, sometimes that's unnecessary. People see that as unnecessary space. And so the pressures that puts on land use as well. I want to thank you for joining me as we